Thank you very much for this introduction, Thomas, and thank you very much for all our guests. I will be very quick and give the let's say we will have sort of two parts of this webinar. The first part will be the Brazilian perspective first, led by Greta Kangang from the Brazilian indigenous organization APIB, and also supported with a statement from Graham Stock at the Investors Initiative for the rainforest, which has been very impactful in highlighting these issues in Brazil. Before we go to part two, where our political guests will reflect on what they have heard. But as an introduction to the introduction to Greta Kangang's presentation about the situation in Brazil, I will share a very small video message from Brazil's to Europe, from Brazil's main indigenous and climate change networks. So please listen carefully and pay attention. It is in English, and I hope that this will play. And with this, I will give the word to Greta to explain how the situation is in Brazil, how you're being impacted by bad policies, and what Europe needs to do. Thank you very much.
Então, primeiro quero agradecer pelo convite, dizer que...
I want to thank you for the invitation. APIB, thanks you for the invitation. It is a good opportunity for us to talk about this subject in Brazil, which is very important. And let me start with the development of COVID-19 in the last few days here. 158 indigenous people have COVID-19, and 31,770 people are infected, and hundreds of people that have passed away. And every month, every day, actually, the virus is spreading. And the government wants to spend 3.5 million against the fires in the Amazon and in the Pantanal, and that definitely will not be enough to do anything against the fires raging. And my worry is really that Pantanal, Cerrado, and other indigenous regions are on fire, and I'm very, very worried. And I'm afraid that we will never be able to recuperate that fauna, all the animals that have lost their lives during those raging fires. And I'm very worried as well that this government's policy has no plan at all. Even the Council on the Amazon, led by the president, the vice president of the Republic, they have no plan. They don't present any clear ideas as to fight the deforestation and the fires. He has no technical knowledge of what is going on and what is happening. They have started a campaign, an international campaign, saying that these finers, that APIB and other social movements that have been denouncing these fires are a farce, and that we are actually lying, is what their campaign is saying. But their campaign is wrong, and the Amazon forest and the Mata Atlantica are different forests, and they are mixing up information, they are mixing up facts, and they know nothing about it. They mix up everything. The biggest problem we're having with our fauna, with the animals, and with the indigenous people. We are really very, very worried about these fires. And we really need Europe's support. We need Germany's support. We need Norway's support to help protect the Amazon. 3.5 million that the government wants to spend are nothing. That is not enough to hire enough people to go fight the fires. And in Brazil, all of our biospheres are dependent of the other ones. So the Amazon, of the Pantanal, the Mata Atlântica, and vice versa. The humidity that exists in these different regions is necessary for the other biospheres as well. The humidity feeds off each other. So the climate change is happening on a worldwide level are affecting not only Brazil, but actually all of Latin America. And this fragility will also have an effect on Europe and other countries and places in the world. Therefore, it is very important, it is necessary more than ever that people understand why this free trade agreement will finance even more deforestation, even more fires, even more land grabbing, even more gold mining, that indigenous areas and protected areas will be robbed. This is an extremely important region for Brazil, for the world, and this agreement will put us in an even more fragile situation. So we're very worried about the destruction of these areas. You have to understand the cycle, the natural cycle of what happens in these environments. I believe that it is necessary that Europe not only listen to what is happening and make announcements and declarations, but really combat what is happening in Brazil right now. As I said earlier, 3.5 million are really nothing at all. And we need a much stronger, much bigger brigade. We need equipment in Brazil so that we can confront the current situation, to protect our villages. This week, many villages burned down and there was no equipment at all to fight the fire. So we have to strengthen our campaigns. And Europe not only has to boycott Brazilian products, but really confront what is going on in Brazil, the forest fires that are going on. And as an indigenous leader, that is what I'm asking you to do. This week has been very, very sad for us. I've had many pictures sent to me by animals that burned, animals that are dying out, animals that play a very important role in these biospheres for the water, for the plants, the seeds, so that the forest can keep on living, keep on growing. And we as indigenous leaders are very, very sad and helpless. We don't know what to do. We've been denouncing what is going on for many years. And this agreement that we're talking about, the free trade agreement, should not be signed in these terms that are being discussed right now. We have to think about which terms we need. We know that this government never keeps his word, its word. The government will say one thing one day and something else the other day. So the documents that were sent to the Brazilian government by the European Union, saying that if Brazil did not stop the forest fires, then the European countries would not buy Brazilian products anymore, or would consume less Brazilian products. That has had positive repercussions already, positive effects. The vice president, the head of the Council of the Amazon, called for a meeting with the Minister for Agriculture and said that it was necessary to decrease the amount of fires. But then a moment later, he said that our campaign was fake news, that our campaign is not based on reality, and therefore they started a campaign against us. So you have to keep up the pressure. The European Union and Europe as a whole needs to keep up the pressure. That is one of the little possibilities we have, because we as indigenous groups, we indigenous leaders, we keep denouncing what is happening in the country, and you are our allies. We have a very strong alliance with you, trying to protect the forests. But we can't only protect the forest by ourselves, and we're not talking about forests only, we're talking about animals, we're talking about plants, and there are animals that can't protect themselves from the fire. Snakes don't run away from the fire. They don't run away, they just burn alive amid run away, but they can't. So when I'm saying that the environment has to be protected, I'm talking about the whole environment. We are part of the environment, just as the water is, just as the forest is, just as the fish are, just as the animal is. In that territory, we all make part, we all are part. And therefore, we have to stand up. And you as Europeans, the European governments need to stand up against the Brazilian government. We are talking to other partners as well in other countries in the world and asking them to start boycotting Brazilian products. Europe was the first continent we started to talk about this common fight that we have, this common struggle that we have. But we're talking to other people as well in China, in the USA, for example, on other continents that buy, that consume Brazilian products. Do people in China know what is happening here in Brazil? Do people in China know what the companies and corporations are doing, what crimes they're committing? And I'm repeating, the animals in the flames can't defend themselves. And it is really very, very, very sad. What we're going through right now is really terrible. So it is important that we unite. We, APIB, are trying to build, well, we actually have some suggestions that we find important. And we want to talk to the European governments that we think are important. 7 emergency measures that are very, very important. These 7 emergency measures, we would like to present them to you. Sonia and Paulinho have mentioned it already, and now I'm going to be talking to you about these 7 emergency measures. Let me present them to you so that you can see that we already have a concrete suggestion. I'm trying to show you these points. So this is a suggestion from APIB, made up of 7 points, and they're all very important and fundamental. And they are not part of the free trade agreement at the moment. The first point we would like to include is the following: a 5-year moratorium on deforestation in Brazil, actually in the Amazon, to be more concrete. We don't have this moratorium in the agreement. And something else that is lacking in this agreement, so this is our second suggestion, our second emergency measure: increased penalties for environmental crimes and deforestation, including the freezing of assets of the 100 worst offenders. That is something not included in this agreement, and we have to make sure that it is. And we have to take up the action plan for prevention and control of deforestation in the legal Amazon, which has been shelved by the Bolsonaro administration once he took office. That was the third element. Now the fourth, we demand the demarcation of indigenous and quilombola lands and the creation, the regularization and the protection of conservation units. And the fifth emergency measure would be the restructuring of federal agencies in charge of the environmental and indigenous rights protection. For example, the IBAMA, the ICMBio, and the FUNAI. Our sixth demand or emergency measure is the imposition of the Forest Code, mainly the amendment from 2018, to penalize illegal land production, the land that is grabbed. And the seventh measure is the construction of a legal framework for supply chain traceability. We want to be able to follow the supply chain and an end to the lack of transparency and penalization of international and national commercial actors that are involved in deforestation and human rights abuses. And none of these are part of the agreement. And I think it is very important that these be discussed. So these elements have to be agreed upon in the Mercosur Free Trade Agreement. And if you don't, and if the European governments don't, then you will be supporting the Brazilian criminal policies. The international financial support is something that we need to use to fight, to combat the deforestation, to fight the land grabbing, to fight the fires in the forests and in the Amazon. And the European Union has to make sure that their companies and corporations and the Brazilian government stick to these agreements, because the Brazilian government will only give in to international pressure. They will not give in to pressure from inside Brazil. And I think the threat of commercial pressure is something that might work towards a change. And that is what I wanted to share with all of you. And I will be here and will be pleased to answer any questions that you might have later on.
Thank you, Greta. Thank you for very, very clear words. And we had some technical issues while you were speaking, but we all heard you very nice and clear. So, but the points were not, at least for some of us, not visible. But I have note of them already, so I'll show them later. But thank you very much for very clear message from the ground, and we are, I think I can speak on behalf of everyone on this call, that we are extremely sad to hear about the devastation and the craziness that is going on now in Brazil. So thank you for telling us that from the ground. It's completely different to hear it directly than from the newspapers and even videos and everything of the dead jaguars, of the drained rivers and the huge areas on fires. Thank you very much. And I think the message that Europe needs to step up and help was loud and clear, and I hope we can all hear that. Our next participant is Graham Stock, who is from Blue Bay Asset Management, but also co-chairing the Investor Policy Dialogue on Deforestation, which has been quite famous because 34 global investors sent a very detailed letter to the Brazilian government in June, and continued from there with a quite detailed political dialogue that also Greta mentioned, that created waves in Brazil, and now we're seeing that also some European countries are following up with some of the same types of messages directly to the Brazilian government about the deforestation crisis. So, Graham, can you start your video and explain what the investors have done, why you did it, and what you're asking the Brazilian government and your counterparts to do?
Absolutely. Thank you, Truls, and thank you very much for the invitation to share this very important platform. It's a great honor. So what I wanted to do today was illustrate another angle of the broad and growing coalition that's pushing the government in Brazil to improve its performance in combating deforestation. And so what I'll do is talk you through the process that we've been through as investors over the last few months in terms of engaging with the government, and then show the requests that we made of the government. And you'll see there that there's a lot of overlap with the messages that Greta was just explaining. So let me share my screen so that you can see what I'm talking about. Hopefully you can see that. Give me a thumbs up, Truls, if you can see that on your screen. Excellent. So in June of this year, led initially by Storebrand, a Norwegian asset management company, a group of 29 investors wrote a letter to the Brazilian embassies in Europe, the USA, Japan, and I think a couple of other places. And those investors together had assets under management of almost $4 trillion US. So these are important institutional investors. And the aim at that point was just to try and draw attention at the embassy level to investor concern around deforestation in Brazil. Now, we of course respect the principles of national sovereignty. We're not trying to change from the outside, but we wanted to get the message across to the authorities in Brazil that as financial institutions, we see deforestation and the associated impacts on biodiversity and climate change as systemic risks. They have the potential to negatively impact our returns and therefore the returns for our clients, who are pensioners, public sector workers, savers across Europe, the US and beyond. To be honest, we were surprised at the degree of take-up, the degree of enthusiasm on the part of the Brazilian authorities to engage with us on this topic. The letter went out on a Monday in June. By the end of that week, the governor of the central bank had called us at BlueBay because he knows us as major fixed income investors in the Brazilian market. He wanted to understand the thinking behind our letter, wanted to know why we were raising this issue now, and wanted to suggest that we should talk to the Amazon Council, led by Vice President Hamilton Mourão, along with the Environment Minister, the Agriculture Minister, the Governor of the Central Bank himself. And sure enough, within a couple of weeks, he'd arranged that meeting. Obviously, in these times of COVID, it was a remote meeting. But we had a video conference with Vice President Mourão and the other people that I just mentioned, where again, we got a chance to communicate our concerns and to ask for action on the part of the Brazilian government to address some of these concerns. Now, the response obviously was polite. There were some promises made on the other side, and we tried to make the case that promises are all very good, but we would like to see concrete action. We'd like to see evidence that things are moving in a better direction, and that includes data on that front, but also maybe progress in the legislature, or at the very least a stop to measures in the legislature that might make deforestation more likely. Not just in the Amazon, but in the Pantanal, the Cerrado, the other biomes of importance. About a week or so after that, we had a further meeting with the Speaker of the Lower House, Rodrigo Maia, who again conveyed the message that there are a number of people in Congress and in the Brazilian administration who are very sympathetic to these goals. And I think one thing that we learned over the course of this engagement over the last couple of months is that there are different voices within the Brazilian government. I think the signaling from the top can often be quite negative, but we believe that there are people in the government working for a more positive agenda. Having spoken to Rodrigo Maia, we then, towards the end of towards the end of August, spoke with the EU ambassador to Brazil and his team, and he told us that, as you said in your introduction, and as Greta just said, this engagement from the investor community was starting to get a lot of attention domestically. Whereas a year ago, the government was pushing back on criticism of their record on the environment, refusing to engage, portraying it as just the message coming from a few small vested interest groups. The broadening of the coalition, they felt, was moving it up the agenda, and this is why the Amazon Council was formed, and why we're seeing more engagement. So we were encouraged by that message, and partly in response to that, we've decided to formalize our group and create a work plan for the next couple of years to engage with the Brazilian authorities on these issues. And in fact, we've formalized the structure of the investor policy dialogue on deforestation, and we'll soon be considering whether we should extend it to other countries as well. We think it would be unfair to single out Brazil on these issues. There are lots of other countries in the emerging market universe where our firms invest that also have work to do on this front. So it's not just a Brazilian problem; it's a global problem, and we want to make sure that comes across as well. So what exactly did we ask the authorities to do? There were 5 points on our request list. We want to see a significant reduction in deforestation rates, which would mean compliance or better compliance with Brazil's climate law, specifically Article 19. We want to see the enforcement of Brazil's forest code. We believe that a lot of the legislation in Brazil is good legislation. The problem is that it's not implemented properly. And so that comes to the third point, which is that we want to see Brazil's agencies that are tasked with implementing this legislation properly enabled to carry out their mandates. And certainly any legislative developments that might represent a backward step, we would like to see halted and taken off the agenda in Congress, which is why we spoke to Rodrigo Maia about these issues. Then the fourth point is concrete progress in the prevention of fires in and near forest areas, not just in the Amazon, but in the Pantanal, the Cerrado, and elsewhere. At the time, we were hoping to avoid the repetition of the fires seen in 2019. Clearly, the data so far this year suggests that the situation is going to be at least as bad and maybe worse. But again, progress towards a better fire season in the future would be a positive. And then the fifth point, in many ways for us as investors, is most important, and that's better access to data. So data on deforestation, on forest cover, on land ownership in sensitive areas. And all this leads to improved traceability of supply chains. So Greta mentioned this as well. We don't just lend money in bonds to the Brazilian government, but we also lend to companies that are active in these sectors, the protein producers in Brazil, and of course in other countries as well. And we want them to be able to demonstrate that their supply chains are clean, that they are not producing cattle on land that's been illegally occupied, or feeding their cattle with crops that have been illegally planted. And that's very difficult to do unless you've got good data and that data is being widely shared. So that was the fifth point, to maintain access to data. We are a little worried that some of the changes in some of the regulatory agencies over the last few months is making that more difficult. And so it's something that we are keeping a close eye on. So in sum, those are the 5 things that we asked the government to address. Now, clearly, it's far too soon to assess results on that. But we have been, as I say, encouraged by the engagement that's taken place. They didn't have to talk to us, and they did. But the proof of the whole process will be in concrete results. So fewer fires, less deforestation, and good data. And clearly that's an ongoing process. That's something that we'll be monitoring over the coming months and years. And I think with this engagement, we've put the Brazilian government on notice that if they don't make progress in these areas, their cost of financing is going to go up. We believe that the maintenance of biodiversity, sustainable development are things that improve Brazil's long-term growth prospects, and that makes Brazil a better credit for investors like us to invest in. If things go the wrong direction, then those costs are going to rise, and that will be problematic, not just for this government, but for future governments in Brazil as well. So that's really our point of contact is as investors, and therefore through the investment prism. But of course, we share the concerns, the concerns that Greta expressed around not just biodiversity and flora and fauna, but the human costs of the government's record as well. Thank you very much for your time, everyone. And I'm happy to take questions in the next session.
Thank you, Graham. Very good and focused presentation, and also very important responsibility taking by the finance sector that we have not seen many other places before. So I hope this is, as I say, not a sort of unique thing, but a general movement in the direction of sustainable responsibility also from the finance sector. Just one sort of immediate question to you, since Greta pointed out sort of the free trade agreement as an important milestone for the Brazilian government, and of course it's not on your list to or within responsibilities to say yes or no to that agreement. But if Brazil would enter a free trade agreement with Europe, that would most likely also help them get cheaper access to finance. And if they would not get this agreement, they would probably increase their cost of finance. Or how is that dynamic?
No, I think that's fair. Free trade agreements generally are intended to help exports in particular. And so, yes, the signature of the agreement would be a long-term positive. It takes time for these things to play out. And of course, it also depends on how domestic policies evolve, not just in Brazil, but across the whole of Mercosur. But yes, we would see it as a positive if that agreement is signed for Brazilian financing costs, and a negative if it's held up. And I think making deforestation a key issue in the signature again helps to broaden the pressure on the government to act on that front.
Very good. Thank you very much for that clarification. And I think that's a reasonable entry into the next part, where we will invite politicians to. Oops! Here we get the poll first. Before we introduce the politicians, have you all got the poll in everybody in your face? On sort of preconditions, before we start to talk about the agreement, please fill out the poll. First, do you support the measures presented by the panelists? 7 measures by them from Greta, from APIB, and 5 measures presented by Graham from the investors. Second question, how do you think the EU should handle the current Mercosur agreement? Ratify as it is, use it as leverage, or reject regardless? It is possible to fill out now, or to sort of have it in the back pocket and fill out the poll during the next session, maybe. Because now we'll discuss the measures and get the views from politicians. So I can sort of invite Rainer Handelfinger, who's the mayor of Obergrafendorf in Austria. He's also a board member of the Climate Alliance and very engaged in these issues. We have also Irmi Salsinger from the Austrian Ministry of Climate Protection, Environment, Energy, Mobility and Innovation. And we have Saskia Brickmont, Belgian politician from the Green Group and member of the European Parliament. Can you turn your videos on so we can see you, all 3? Oops. Now very much happened here at the same time. Thank you, Madli, for getting all the questions. Support all of them. Most people support most measures. And it's almost a split between use the agreement as leverage and reject it. Which will be a very interesting message for the politicians. Oops. Here are the sort of the background, the political reflections. The Brazilian 7 measures and the investors 5, just as a background. And I would think I could see also, yeah, there we are, Rainer and Irmi and Saskia. Excellent. I thought I could see both the sort of the slide and you at the same time, but it doesn't seem to work. Or is it just my problem? Okay, so here are the background notes. I don't make and now, since we have heard from kind of both the Brazilian civil society perspective and European investor perspective, that foreign pressure is important and Europe has a possibility to help, but also, of course, a big responsibility because we are huge importer of forest destruction from Brazil. How do you as politicians think we in Europe, you can contribute to underline this message towards Brazil that the investors have now done in a powerful way, and what will be sort of the main political options as you see it? And maybe we can take it from the sort of local mayor perspective to the national government perspective, and then get the final round from the European Parliament perspective on that first question.
Hello, my name is Rainer. I'm a mayor from a small municipality in Austria. We have about 5,000 inhabitants in our municipality, and we are a Climate Alliance member since 1990. Since 1999. And so we have a big responsibility to work on the same issues on for example, the deforestation in the Amazon basin. And we did some resolutions on the free trade agreement of TTIP and CETA 5 years ago. So we had a resolution and we tried to invite all municipalities in Europe to sign this agreement or this resolution, and I think we should do this once again. And the Climate Alliance and the Seattle to Brussels network did develop such a resolution, and we should spread this all over Europe to find some regions and municipalities to sign this resolution against the free trade agreement of the EU-MERCOSUR. That's one of the points we can put some pressure from the local level to the levels. It's important to give this pressure to the national levels, for example, so that IRME, for example, has also the possibility to say, we have such a big pressure from the municipalities, there is no other possibility than to not sign this treatment. That would be a big help for the national levels, which are not always very happy to sign such treatments, and so we have to give them some opportunity to find some helping pressure from the local level.
Good. That's a good challenge then to the next level, Irmi Salser, and I think it will also sort of for you. It's an additional question because in the Brazilian debate, latest yesterday, as a response to the letter from several European governments to Brazil, the Vice President said that well, this is just protectionistic trade strategy from Europe. It has nothing to do with deforestation. So, since Austria now has been quite negative to this agreement for a long time, how or what can you do to ensure that this on protectionism and fear for efficient Brazilian agriculture, but actual real concern for deforestation and human rights?
Okay, hello everyone. Thanks for having invited me. I joined. I was a part of the platform against TTIP and CETA some years ago. So I was still in the civil society sector then, and we were fighting against free trade agreements because we think free trade agreements are not for the sake of the people, for the well-being of the people, but it's for profit and for big business, and big business and governments and international authorities try to sell these free trade agreements to the people, that it's for the well-being of the people, which is not true. And we have strong evidence that most free trade agreements they cause harm on both sides, but of course there are winners for the free trade agreements on both sides as well. So it's not Europe against, in case of the United States, or in case of MERCOSUR, Brazil against Europe, but it's business, big business, corporate business, big business which wants to make profits against the people on both sides. And now we have the sort of, let's say, a little bit awkward or strange situation that Austria, for the first time in many years, has a strong political commitment from most parties, nearly all of the parties, against the free trade agreement, and the motivation for the parties is very different. We have some political parties, and the Green Party, I'm a member of the Green Party, we are against the free trade agreements because we are in favor of the people, we are in favor of the fight against the climate crisis, the fight against the crisis of biodiversity. But other parties, for example, the Conservative Party, they have more or less these protectionist motivations because they want to protect the Austrian agriculture against the import of beef, for example, or import of sugar of countries in South America. So we have different motivations, but this caused, let's say, it caused a common agreement, and the Austrian government is sort of, not sort of, we have the duty to follow the decisions in the parliament. And the parliament, both chambers of the Austrian parliament decided it was in a phase before the elections where there was no coalition, so the parties could vote in the way they wanted to vote for. Both chambers voted against MERCOSUR. It's a strong binding decision, and the federal government is called upon to ensure that Austria takes a stand in EU bodies against the conclusion of the trade agreement with the MERCOSUR states. So. And then there's also, in addition, this must be expressed in all votes with the rejection of the agreement. And this is a binding decision. So our ministers of the Conservative Party and the Green Party, of course, they have to follow this decision, and we have to feel bound. But for the Austrian Minister of Agriculture, not of Agriculture, but the Minister of Climate Change and Environment and so on, as my minister, which I'm working for, it's, of course, we are against this treatment because we have to prevent it, in our opinion, for ecological and for social reasons. we know the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis. These are the biggest crises of mankind ever. And of course, a treaty like the MERCOSUR agreement will push these crises forward. So it's really important to see this fight against the climate change and against the climate crisis as a global responsibility. And of course, we need to contribute to the power of the people in Brazil and in the other countries of South America to combat the deforestation, for example. And so it's sometimes also a little, let's say, it's a dilemma, of course, because if some people keep telling us that if we conclude this agreement, then maybe we have the possibility to enforce, for example, these 7 measures, these 7 demands, which have been lined out. But the experience shows us that if we conclude trade agreements, all these political deals which are around these agreements, they are only on paper, and it's very, very difficult to enforce them. And the thing which is enforced is free trade. We saw this with CETA, we saw this with other agreements. Let's say the nice packaging of these agreements is normally only a packaging. It's a greenwashing of these agreements. And so we have to find other possibilities to support the people of Brazil, the indigenous people, and the small farmers, the campesinos and campesinas. We have to find other ways to support them against in their fight against deforestation and use of pesticides, for example, and all these struggles which they are fighting for. So we are now trying to increase the pressure also on President Bolsonaro and other leaders. My minister, for example, she recently wrote a letter to the Brazilian embassy in Austria, which should be forwarded then to the Brazilian Minister of Environment regarding the deforestation in the Amazonas. So we have to, in our opinion, we have to find different means to support the people than concluding a trade agreement which will do a lot of harm on both sides.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. And when you we asked earlier, you asked earlier about the sound, and I think the sound will be even better if you use headsets. So sorry for that. But it was possible to understand. But for the next comment, it would be great with headset. Saskia Brickmont, do you have comments to this? Kind of how can this kind of what is the political space on the European Parliament level with the clear message from Brazil, clear message from investors, and a very clear message from some member states, but not all, like Austria. Is it possible to use this agreement for leverage? Is it possible to stop it? Is it possible to do what civil society wants?
Big issue, of course. Hello, everybody. Good evening. Thank you for your testimony. It's very powerful testimony also from you, Greta. Well, I have to say that all the measures that you have pointed out and the initiatives you are taking are fully in line with what the Greens are fighting for. As Imri said, I think we can only support this and take them with us in our fight, because of course, as Greens, we've been taking very clear stand against the MERCOSUR agreement as it is. You know that it has been concluded without impact assessment by the EU Commission, which is already the wrong way to go for us, because we really need impact assessments before to conclude negotiations in order to take the different recommendations into account. This has not been done. And that's why the Greens, and I can send you the link, or maybe through the organizers, it can be sent to the participants, but we made our own impact assessment as Green Group in the European Parliament that we published in January, which pointed out clear problems, as you just mentioned, but also broader issues going to agriculture, the use of pesticides, the fact that it would change also the economic dynamic, regional dynamic between the Mercosur countries, and that the deal would not as such profit so strongly to countries as Uruguay, Paraguay, and even Argentina, but mainly to Brazil. And then the European Commission just released its own impact assessment 1 year later, 1 year after the negotiations, which was published in the summer. And I presume that you had a very careful look at it. But even though if the summary is quite positive, if you dig into the text, you see that there are a lot of problematic elements and even recommendations done by LSE Consulting. They're not green, they're not politicians. It's an independent study that coming to deforestation week. Still, they recommend to reinforce anti-point the climate issues, pesticides. They also point the social measures that need to be implemented to alleviate poverty, to work on poverty, and so on. The impact on women, on the indigenous people, and they recommend a series of initiatives that should be taken in order to equilibrate the argument. And so here we have a strong study that shows that as such the Mercosur agreement is totally incompatible with the Green Deal. The Green Deal that has been adopted 1 year ago, and which clearly states that trade agreements should be compliant with the Paris Agreement. Of course, they talk about future trade agreements, but still the Mercosur is maybe concluded, negotiated by the European Commission, but it's still not ratified and not implemented. So it's no or never that we have to fight in order not to allow this document to go through as such. So this is one of our strong fights. It's to make the Mercosur agreement compliant with the Green Deal. Of course, you know that the European Commission wants to go on with the ratification process. It has been clear from the beginning when it was Hogan, Commissioner on Trade, and which had to resign this summer. It was very clear that one of his main objectives during his mandate was to ratify the Mercosur. We're now expecting the hearing in the Trade Committee of the European Parliament of the new commissioner, and of course the Greens will ask him very clearly to say what is willing to do with this agreement and what is his position. Because we heard that since the nomination of the previous Trade Commissioner, the context has changed. The context has changed, the political pressure is different. Some governments, some head of states have strongly taken position against the agreement as such. But what does that mean? Does that mean that now, and that's what we fear, that now the Council is negotiating with the different governments of the member states in order to have kind of an addition or a protocol specifically on the climate issues and on deforestation, which would be, of course, important, but not enough, not enough. What we fear is that as a symbol, they would claim, okay, we reached an agreement with Bolsonaro and there is a moratorium on deforestation, for example. But do we really believe that Bolsonaro will stop his policies? Do we really believe that he will come back on his statement saying Paris Agreement, I don't care, I don't believe in climate change. I have to say no. I have to say no. I don't think we can trust him in this. So now, saying this, I have to say I do not know today if we have a majority to take the deal down in the European Parliament. In all the political groups, the main political groups, there are opponents, clearly. There are opponents. But if a deal is reached, as I said, a kind of a protocol or an addition, because they won't renegotiate the text, the Commission is clear about that, they will not reopen the negotiations. I fear that even people that are very skeptical about this agreement today would accept it if there's this protocol on specifically on climate issues. And again, I say for us it's not enough, because it's also about agriculture. It's also about due diligence, and you know maybe that we are working on this at the European Parliament, and I have to say there has been a commitment from the Commissioner on Justice, Didier Reynders, that he would come with legislation on due diligence by 2021, and we want this to be included also in the trade agreements, due diligence of business and of investors. So we really think we need to rebuild the trade agreements. We're not as against free trade and international trade, but as it exists now, the environmental, social, human costs of these agreements are too high. And that's why we are really putting the pressure to say no to the Mercosur agreement as it is on the table today. Last thing is, and I agree with that, we need to go further in the pressure, because there has been some steps taken by the government, but clearly not enough. And I find, of course, your initiative at the finance level very interesting, because it's also a way to say, okay, we can have sustainable finance, and that's what we want. We do not want to contribute to deforestation, to environmental damage, and to climate change. And this is very powerful, and that's why we work also now at the national level. And I think you had Anna Cavazzini as a previous guest also. We work also to the supermarkets and in order to have their commitment, as the financial sector did, to try to make them aware of their supply chains, and if they work with products, if they sell products coming from deforestation of the Amazon. And that's what we're now entering to push them to take strong stand and saying, okay, we boycott the products as long as there's no change in Bolsonaro's politics. So that's for the short term and the emergency measures. But then on the longer term, I think we really need to rethink the agreement entirely.
Thank you for very, very good and detailed and also very clarifying answers and comments, also including the entire European Parliament political process and balancing acts. Just sort of one small direct follow-up, because I noted that you mentioned the LSE sustainability assessment, which of course many on the environmental side has sort of slaughtered because it's so pro ratification. But at the same time, it has, as you pointed out, an extremely long list of proposed fencing policies, which are very overlapping with the 7 emergency measures proposed by APIB, and also many of the same transparency and enforcement issues listed by the investors. So I think, because one of the discussions whether this ends with ratification or not ratification of this agreement is sort of like in the poll said, 50-50 no deal, 50-50 use as leverage to fix the problem. The main point, I think, from us that are mostly focused on rainforest and human rights issues is that this is a very powerful process. It's one of the very few things that the Brazilian government really wants, that Europe can give or not give based on some conditions. So at least whatever happens with the process, it needs to be clear that there need to be some minimum thresholds on deforestation, nature protection, and human rights that Brazil needs to climb in order to even be considered. And I think we also heard from Apib that that should be valid for the EU-MERCOSUR agreement, and it should also be the same type of criteria for membership of the OECD, which is also on sort of in the political discussions. Is it possible to sort of be negative to the deal and at the same time present these clear minimum thresholds that are in line with the LSE assessment, with the APIB emergency measures, with the investor points, without sort of having to go necessarily all the way every time? Is it possible for sort of between countries political process to have dialogue on that level?
I think so. At least at the European Parliament level, that we can get a majority on this. But now, where I don't see clear is in the European Commission's position, because yesterday when President von der Leyen made her State of the Union speech, so the annual speech that the President of the Commission does, she absolutely didn't mention the Mercosur, and she absolutely didn't mention the European trade policy review that is coming. So not mentioning it means it's not a priority. So we were wondering what does that mean? We heard a couple of weeks ago that the Mercosur issue would be on the agenda of the Council of the 9th of November, and now we hear that it's not on the agenda anymore, which means that they feel there's no majority and that it will be difficult to reach an agreement. But I don't know now where the German presidency stands, because I think, as you mentioned, that they're willing to push this agenda and to try to reach an agreement on the issue of climate and deforestation, and they're working with national governments on this. But still, first, is the German presidency willing to reach, to go further and to be responsible finally of pushing the agenda of the Mercosur? And after the German presidency, we have the Portuguese presidency, and we know that Portugal is more entitled to go further and to get the Mercosur agreement ratified. So the dynamic might change there. After that, we have the Slovakian presidency. I don't think they will make it a priority. I think they will let the lead to the European Commission, but I'm not sure about this. But then we have France, and we know that in the meanwhile, France will be in election period. And so this might also change the dynamics, because I don't think that France, as Macron, take a very strong position. I don't think that he will be willing to really make the Mercosur issue an electoral issue. So I think we can go there, because we can probably reach a majority on these issues at the European Parliament level. But what is sure is that the European Commission will not renegotiate the agreement. So it will be a protocol or an addition, and what is the status of this? Will it be enforceable, and how? So this is still the question today.
Because of course, why we're sort of struggling with this is kind of, many of us are not into this because we're sort of very obsessed with trade agreements. We're into this because we are very obsessed with the politically created environmental crisis, environmental and human rights crisis in Brazil right now. And we just know that for the world's biodiversity, for climate change, for people under threat, it's happening right now. So we're sort of desperately looking for ways to stop it. And we know from Greta's testimony that campaigns and activism, opposition and fight to protect nature from inside Brazil alone is not enough. So what we need is to take our responsibility and more. And so the question is kind of, what is it that we can do that is our responsibility and more? And I think kind of every European city can do like Rainer and put pressure, and they can do like the city of Oslo, that is sort of putting our pension funds into kind of the most sustainable option without fossil fuels and deforestation. Irmi has some points, and we have some questions that have come in. Some of them have been answered. Very good. But Irmi, you have the word.
Yeah, just a quick reply. I think it's one of the killer arguments of the people in the companies and the political forces, actors who are in favor of the Mercosur agreement, because they are in favor of profit for big companies, is that we have to conclude this agreement in order to have a point of pressure on Bolsonaro. So this is the only solution where we can try to force him to sign some agreements which are political binding against deforestation and so on, in favor of protection of indigenous people, in favor of biodiversity, climate change, and so on. And this, I think it's a killer argument, because it's this argument we've heard it so often, and it never ever worked. That this additional signature for something helped the people and the planet in no trade agreement before. I'm really sure that if there was a binding additional agreement treaty on Mercosur, Bolsonaro would not sign it. If it's somehow really binding him. So what is the thing we have in our hands in Europe? We should not concentrate on this Mercosur agreement to say, but this is the only way to politically force it. But we should really be creative in very many different ways. I think cities which are divesting, for example, it's a great thing, and we have to do this on many levels, on the European level, on the national level, on the city level, on the community level. We are importing a lot of soy, as all of the European member states. We produce a lot of soy in Europe as well, which we do not buy because it's cheaper to import the soy from Brazil or Argentina. So we have we already import a lot of beef. So it's not about lowering the trade barriers. We can lift them. We can raise them. We can have higher trade barriers, for example, to have some sanctions against the government. And I think we should not go in this trap to say the Mercosur agreement is the only way we can pressure you.
No, I think that's a very valid point. Kind of, this is not the only tool we have, and kind of lifted by kind of we have the investors, we have the European due diligence legislation, we have the zero deforestation various approaches, and we have corporate responsibilities. We have lots of stuff, and we have the OECD membership. But at the same time, this is one process, and I think kind of my worst nightmare in this is sort of if if this agreement was just going through even without getting any promises or legislative changes or thresholds linked to the disaster situation, that would be 100% unacceptable. And as Paulo Barreto points out, that several studies shows that just after ratification of free trade agreements, deforestation goes up, and other studies have shown that it's quite common to see increased deforestation also just before. So kind of this entering of free trade agreement has, on a general basis, lots of negative effects on the environment in most countries, and we need to find a way that that doesn't happen. At the same time, now deforestation is going up regardless of free trade agreement, and Europe is importing enormous amounts of deforestation through meat, through leather, through soy from Brazil already. So our footprint and responsibility is huge. So we have to do something, not just because we're nice, but because it's our responsibility. Did you try to say something, or did you?
Yes, I agree. I agree, and I want to say something, adding on what you're saying, because this is completely true. But the Mercosur agreement and all the political process around this is an opportunity to raise awareness about the situation, because last summer there was a huge reaction and Bolsonaro's policy, and since then it hasn't stopped. And since then we've seen that the forest has been burning the whole summer, but public awareness is not the same anymore. It's already as if we were used to this information, and I think still citizens are sensitive to this. And where we can make the difference, and politicians also need you, is to raise public awareness, to be present, to put pressure all the time, wherever you can, and build alliances, as you did it around the TTIP, as we did it several times. I negotiated last year the trade agreement with Vietnam. Unfortunately, Vietnam doesn't really raised public awareness, but the situation of human rights over there is catastrophic. And still the European Parliament decided to ratify the agreement because the majority is thinking that if we have a trade agreement, then we have a leverage to put the pressure on the Vietnamese government. But we thought that we should use the ratification process in order to put that pressure and to have strong engagements from the government. And this is the same here. And if this engagement don't come, then we can say, well, then we definitely do not ratify this agreement, because you don't take the needed steps in order to make it possible. So I really think that all the pressure that can be put now is important. And of course, it's important here, and it's important, as Greta said, it's important also in Brazil, that Bolsonaro hears that Europe, that the international community is supporting the fight of the indigenous people, and that what is going on over there. But if there's no public pressure, then we lose the fight. I mean, one thing that is important in the Mercosur agreement is that we have the agricultural sector in Europe with us for other reasons. But still it's important because it makes a difference when it comes to pressure the politicians, also in the European Parliament.
Good. I think that will be one of the sort of last calls to action here, is sort of to continue to make noise, continue to tell the story, continue to let Europeans know. And I think it will also be quite good if sort of, since we know that the investor letter engagement has worked, lots of other sectors need to engage and can do the same. And I think they are very, very powerful with 34 global investors engaged. but that is only a fraction of the amount of powerful investors across Europe and across rest of the world that could engage. So I think it would be fantastic if we can inspire other investors to join the initiative with force, and other sectors to join similar initiatives, and of course the political system to do as Austria is doing, and as Rainer is doing in the city, and as Saskia is doing in the parliament. Greta, I think it would be very good if you could reflect some points about what you've heard, if this makes you encouraged or not to continue the fight, and if there are particular things that you think we should bring with us into the very dark European night.
Então, primeiro que
First of all,
compramos essa briga pela não ratificação.
we know our struggle for the non-ratification of this free trade agreement, because we don't want Bolsonaro's genocidal, environmental politics to get any support. The 7 measures that we suggested earlier, that we presented earlier, the emergency measures, are directed to all of you and also the representatives of the European Parliament. We as APB and as the indigenous leaders of APB, we're making very clear that we have to cross borders, that Europe plays an important role, and that Europe needs to tell our government that they have to take radical steps in Brazil. And that is something other partners have to do as well, other international partners as China and the US, for example. So this alliance is something that we're working towards, and it's not only up to us, the indigenous people in Brazil, to wage this war. There are future generations. We, as indigenous people, are always thinking of the future generations, of our children. These children of ours are threatened due to this agreement. Our forests, our environment is under threat every day under this government. And we have lost many indigenous leaders in this fight due to COVID-19, but especially because of their defense of the Amazon region, of the Cerrado, of the Pantanal. Many of our leaders are being criminalized because of these trade agreements. So Europe has to be aware, European Parliament has to be aware that there is a need for pressure, that European companies have to take a stand as well, and that the repercussions are very, very heavy on our lives and on Brazil. It is very difficult for us in Brazil. You have to understand what is happening in Brazil with land grabbing. That has an impact on Europe as well. Many investors are investing in these public areas, buying these territories. With their investments, the European pension funds have been contributing to this through the World Bank that's been funding big projects in protected areas, in indigenous land, indigenous territories. So you really have to see what your pensionists, your retired people, what impact they have, how they are influencing Brazilian policies and Brazilian politics, agro-business in Brazil, soy, beef has not suffered at all. They are the ones who most made money and profited in this war, because we are in a war right now. The big companies are the ones that are profiting, but we, the fragile communities, the indigenous people, the people living on the periphery of the big cities, without basic access, for example, to water. They privatized our water, but there is no sanitary infrastructure for us. We are in the middle of a pandemic, and many people in the peripheries of the cities and in the indigenous territories have no access to basic needs. And European funds need to be very clear as to where they want to invest. The World Bank has to be accountable for the investments they're making. And so we need this clear-cut information on their investments. So.
Thank you very much, Greta. We also have a very few closing words from another Brazilian, Maria Daura Canho from Human Rights Watch Brazil, and then we will also do a short ending poll before we're finished with this session. Maria Daura, thank you very much.
Thank you, Truls. Thank you so much for letting me say some things and also another perspective. And thank you so much for organizing this webinar. I think this is, as you said, Brazil wants this deal. So probably, of course, there are other ways, but this is one of the few instruments that we have right now to pressure the government of Brazil to do something in the right direction. And it's very important that investors and civil society are together to think about these benchmarks, right? We believe as Human Rights Watch, we've been documenting the human rights consequences of the destruction of the environment, not only for the security of people and defenders, but also for the health of people. And we really think that Europe has to send the message, a very clear and categorical message right now, that it cannot consider the EU, consider the ratification of the agreement until Brazil makes steps. And another thing is that it's not enough to send proposals, plans without concrete results, and the investors have done that, and APIB as well, to ask Brazil really to follow up on really concrete measures to show that the deforestation will be going down and what they are going to do to do that. It's not enough to present plans without the real intention to follow through. And this is a government that we don't trust that is going the right direction. And finally, it's very, very important that these benchmarks don't only focus on the decrease on deforestation, but also a problem that is behind deforestation, and it's fundamental to deal with it, which is violence and impunity. Like we know by heart and by documenting that the deforestation is in large part promoted by criminal networks, which are very powerful, have the logistic capacity and money to continue to deforest the forest, but also intimidate and kill defenders. So it's very important that this message comes across. We think that at the end of the day, what is needed is to make progress to end the state of lawlessness and ensure that conditions exist for the defenders to protect the rainforest. So we need to ask the government to show progress on prosecuting and taking to trial these people that kill indigenous leaders and also public agents that tries to protect the environment. So thanks so much, Truls, and this is the message that this should be also included in these benchmarks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining this seminar. I think it was a super interesting discussion, and I couldn't help myself just to kind of throw out questions to the fantastic panelists. This is the closing poll. Was this okay? And do you want more webinars? It's also possible to say that some places. and at least I hope that we can continue to raise the issue of the violence, human rights violations, deforestation, and politically created crisis in Brazil and other forests as the time go by. So thank you very much for joining. Thank you very much, everybody in Climate Alliance, for hosting this so perfectly with us. And see you next time. That was a very good vote. You are too kind, everybody.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Perfect. So it's dark everywhere now. Not in Brazil, but here in Europe. You have to lit candles, maybe.